There we go. Thank you. So a quick review to give you an idea of what it is I'm hoping to accomplish for the rest of the term, what I'm hoping we'll be able to accomplish for the rest of the term. I've asked you to read the first chapter of Treblecock and Kelly's book, The Making of the Mosaic. And Treblecock and Kelly lay out an intellectual framework within which they do describe the development of Canadian immigration policy. And I want to offer a counter proposal to describe today a different framework, a competing framework, let's say, within which some of what I think of as, and a number of people have pointed out, I'm mostly reporting on the result of my reading. This isn't original academic work that I'm doing. I'm reporting to you and trying to work through with you some of the results in the research on these issues. And so in Treblecock and Kelly's book, they set up a framework within which they propose to tell what they describe as the story of the development of Canadian immigration policy. And in a certain kind of way, the characters in that story are ideas, interests, and institutions. And that's a recognizably and a very productive strategy that's adopted by academic researchers and also by policymakers as they reflect on the policies that they're adopting and the problems that those policies are developed to address. But I think there are shortcomings in that framework, and it's those shortcomings that I want to try to develop with you today, and to try to work out what a competing framework might look like that would address those shortcomings. And so in order to make that more concrete, for now, I'm going to switch over to my slides. But before I switch over to the slides, I do want to reiterate my view that our sessions are always better when you participate more. They're not just better for me, and perhaps crucially, not just better for the individual students who take the time and take the risk of contributing, but they're better, in my view, for all of the students, even those students who don't speak up, who don't type in their views. I'm convinced that they benefit from, or they can benefit anyway, from having the input of the other students in the group. And that's particularly and that philosophy of teaching corresponds in some ways with the intellectual framework that I'm going to try to develop for you. One way of putting it is, it's my view that this course was designed because of my belief, and Lamin, my colleague, because of our belief that in some ways students' own views and students' own experiences are left out of the content of many of the courses that we offer. Now, it's entirely possible that that's completely legitimate in lots and lots of courses. I know Seneca, I think they still have, they at least used to have a program on underwater welding, and I'm not sure how students' experiences would be important one way or the other in underwater welding. I might be just misunderstanding the whole thing there, but in this case, Canada in a global world, migration, globalization, and citizenship, it's crystal clear to me, almost self-evident really, that students experience as students, and especially at Seneca College, given our mix of international students and domestic students, especially given the fact that that institutional setting, so that the college setup that includes international students and domestic students, in order for that to operate, the very legislation, the very policies that Trebilcock and Kelly were looking at moderate the possibility of the international students in our course taking these courses. So the development of the policies that we're looking at are part and parcel of the delivery of this course and indeed of the continued operation of the college. So what we're looking at and what we're trying to understand is part of your lives as students at the college, both international students and domestic students taken together. And in a certain way, that's, it seems to me, what's missing from Trebilcock and Kelly's framework. There's a secondary issue around that in Trebilcock and Kelly's book that I'll briefly address. I don't remember 100% if I raised it last week, but I just want to quickly put it on the table. I did mention last week that I looked at a number of reviews of Trebilcock and Kelly's book. And one area of agreement among some of the reviewers was that although in the introduction they do lay out this framework that I've spent some time, maybe too much time, but some time trying to lay out for you, but the criticism that was raised by some reviewers was that as soon as they turned to telling the actual story, they very largely speaking abandon the theoretical framework that they describe in the introductory chapter, and that they eventually return to in the concluding chapter. But as they tell the story, that framework is basically abandoned, and they never make good on their claim to demonstrate that the ideas end up having more impact than the interests. And that seems to me in part to be a legitimate criticism of the book. But I think, and this is what I'm going to try to describe a little bit when I turn to my slides, it seems to me that the real problem is not that they forgot to do it, but that their theoretical framework itself blocks them from being able to do that. And so I'm going to turn to my slides now to try to make that case for you, and then to try to discuss it with you. So you'll remember, I hope, that they wrote in this book, the story of Canadian immigration policy is told from the perspective of the major participants involved in the different stages in the policy's evolution. Blah, blah, blah. However, a reflective re-examination of our collective past reveals a set of core normative and ethical values that have been fundamental in the making of the Canadian mosaic, and, when rendered explicit, provide perspective on the central issues of immigration policy that confront us today and will do so in the future. Now, they make clear in the following pages the reason they stress it this way is because, to a great degree, most people who most people who study, no, sorry, let me start over. To a great degree, the other side of that coin, that is this, so their framework is interests and ideas, and they take some time to develop the claim that ideas are important. The reason they do that is because in some ways it's kind of self-evident that interests are important. After all, on a widely shared view but and ultimately, in my view, and a mistaken view, what a government does, especially what a government like the government of Canada does, is they have elections. At elections, different groups, political parties, present themselves and propose to the voting population a set of policies that will advance interests of the population. And that's how we understand what happens. What a government does is it advances the interests of a number of people, and that seems like a sensible, that seems like a grown-up, that seems like a practical way of analyzing and understanding what the government does. But correctly, but with limits, I think Trebilcock and Kelly insist on and in part demonstrate that these interests themselves are constrained in some specific cases by commitments to ideas on the part of the very people whose interests are being pursued. And so the interests and the ideas are the interests and ideas of people and groups of people. And so they end up problematically sometimes conflicting with each other. So ideas, interests, and institutions provide us with the framework. Okay, which ones? Well, we took a look briefly, and Trebilcock and Kelly line up for us. They identify for us in a certain kind of way the names of the characters in the story of the development of Canadian immigration policy. And the ideas are two competing ideas, the idea of freedom and the idea of community. In a certain way, it's the idea of the individual versus the idea of the community. Roughly speaking, that's how Trebilcock and Kelly understand the distribution of key ideas on the idea side of the equation they're trying to formulate. And neither Kelly nor Trebilcock are philosophers. They cite the philosophical views of a number of admittedly very influential political philosophers and thinkers, and arguably even, I think, perhaps the most influential in the academic world. But they, for certain, 100% for sure, have drawn on a subset of the available ideas. And that's part of the challenge that I'm going to pick up today. What have they left out in the set of ideas that they've described? When they turn to interests, they look at business groups, labor groups, and ethnic groups as the key components to how, as the key players, say, in the story of the development of immigration policy in Canada, really since 1867. They do a decent job of trying to describe the historical conditions that led up to 1867 and the British North America Act and the founding of the Dominion of Canada and its sort of independence from Great Britain. So from 1867 on, they demonstrate through, I think, a historically valuable, academically valuable examination of the historical record of the way Canadian business groups and Canadian labor groups and eventually Canadian ethnic groups enter into the public process of trying to shape the government policy on immigration. And so when they talk about, so we looked at ideas and interests. Now, what about institutions? I'm going to make this a bit bigger. So they acknowledge that, or their setup is that ideas are one thing, interests are another, and by and large, the way ideas and interests interact, at least insofar as they interact in the construction and the development and the implementation and the adaptation of immigration policy in Canada, mostly through the legal and government framework, is that it's through institutions that these ideas and these interests interact one with the other, and the institutions are uh, responsive to the interests, but they're organized on the basis of elections, and so it's a largely parliamentary story that they are telling. And I think that's absolutely legitimate, and I'm not making at all that making the claim that that's not a crucial and important part. But what I want to demonstrate to you, or I want us to think about together, is basically, is something missing? And I want to turn to the work of a more recently, although I think she's roughly a kind of I think she's basically the same age as Elise Treblecock. She's a very experienced sociologist, Nina Glick-Schiller. And in a widely cited now chapter, she wrote about migration and development without methodological nationalism. So the name of the problem that I want to call to your attention, that I want us to try to begin to understand, is methodological nationalism. So she writes about her own work and about this chapter from a book. In this chapter, I build on scholars who advocate an institutional analysis of contemporary migration policies and discourses. But I want to continue the argument by further proposing a global power perspective that can link contemporary forces of capitalist restructuring to the specific localities within which migrants live and struggle. So I want to unpack that a bit. So what is she talking about? What does it look like when she starts to develop a global perspective? So the key element is that she's trying to demonstrate and then provide some conceptual tools to probe and to better understand what's the total context within which Canada operated such that immigration was a problem and a solution. Treblecock and Kelly, to a great degree, and in doing this, as Glick-Schiller stresses really in her article, and has been made the case to a growing degree recently in the migration studies field and in other fields that study migration, that is that scholars tend to adopt a national perspective when they try to understand migration. And in a way, that makes sense, but in a way, it's crazy. It makes sense since, in the case of Treblecock, in the case of Treblecock, he's a law professor at a Canadian university, and so the context within which he works is a Canadian context. And it also makes sense given what he's studying. He's studying Canadian immigration policy. So what's crazy about it? What's missing? Okay, so we saw that Treblecock and Kelly have analyzed, have offered an extended account of, they've told a story about the development of um, immigration policy in Canada from more or less from 1867 to 2003, I think, is when the first edition came out. But whenever the end point is, they take a look at the development of immigration policy. And what is it they look at? They look at the ideas and interests of the people involved. And what those interests are is Canadian business interests, Canadian labor group interests, and Canadian ethnic group interests. And that makes sense in a certain way since they're looking at Canadian immigration policy. But what are they not looking at? What is excluded from all of those considerations when they're trying to understand immigration? Well, I'll give you an example that I raised. I think I raised it last week. In any event, I'll give you an example, a biographical example that comes from my right. So they failed to fully address and include in their framework. So never mind in the development of the account that they give, in their framework, they don't talk about the global context within which this is happening. Why is it that, for example, so before Dawn answered it, I started with a more concrete example, perhaps. On my mother's side, my ancestors are Irish. My grandmother immigrated to Canada at the beginning of the 20th century, but my grandfather's family, almost certainly, there's a little bit of uncertainty here, but almost certainly emigrated to Canada following the Irish potato famine. What's missing from the story that Treblecock and Kelly talk about is why is it that the Irish were looking to get out of Ireland? And part of what's going on in Ireland was part of what was going on in Ireland turns out to be directly related to what was going on in Canada. Canada and Ireland, it wasn't Canada in the 1840s. It was I don't even remember exactly what it was called, but it was a British colony still. In the 1840s, the northern half of the North American landmass was governed by England from London, and Ireland was governed by and governed from England also. Canada and Ireland were both colonial properties of the British Empire. And Irish migrants were starving, at least arguably, as a result of policies that Britain was pursuing in its colonies. Likewise, when we move forward, and so just to pick that particular example, Irish migrants come to Canada. Why they come is part of the internal connection between why they'll be accepted and why they won't be accepted. The British Crown was the political entity that was in charge of deciding who gets in and who doesn't get in to what now is Canada and back then was just British North America. And so if we don't look at the broader global context, we will not understand why is it that the people who chose to come to Canada or who were forced to come to Canada, and that's a trickier distinction than might initially be thought, but the people who end up coming to Canada, where they're coming from, why them, why not other people, these are factors, these are dynamics that are responding to global issues that are not separate from Canadian reality. That the Canadian government and the people in Canada, and in particular, very specifically the interests that are identified by Trebilcock and Kelly that are mobilized one way or the other to change, to formulate and change and adapt um, immigration policy. So what does she say about this? So what is methodological nationalism and what's wrong with that? Well, she goes on to clarify that a little bit, or to articulate it anyway. We'll see if it's clarified for you.
Tony.
To understand, oh, yes.
Hi, it's Tahura.
Hi, Tahura.
I just wanted to clarify if I'm understanding this using my own example. Is that okay?
Great.
So when you're saying about like the reason why people choose to immigrate to Canada, in a previous study we learned about the Chinese immigration head tax. So
Yeah.
this was when laborers were needed to build the railroad,
Right.
railroad in Canada. So they chose Chinese immigrants because they also needed a job to provide for their family back in China. So at that time, Canada allowed a lot of people from, specifically men from China, to come build the railroad so they would get paid and they would send the money back. So is that sort of
That's
connecting to the idea that Canada only let them in because they needed a railroad built?
right. So that's an excellent example. And what I want to, the challenge that I'm trying to describe that Glick Schiller calls methodological nationalism is to describe it as coincidentally. The idea that it's simply a coincidence that all of a sudden in China there are lots of laborers that are available is to misunderstand the connections that exist around the whole globe, the economic connections that exist around the globe, in part because of Western interference in Asia. The Chinese economy was, in some ways, massively dislocated as a result of British imperialism. Now, there were other factors going on as well, for sure. And the main point I want to make is that describing it as a coincidence is a mistake from the point of view of the available kinds of explanations that we have. The questions aren't even asked. The main problem with methodological nationalism is that the question about why were Chinese workers available now? Why were Irish workers available then? What was going on, for example, in India, such that Indian workers were available at the beginning of the 20th century? And the reality is, and it's well studied, although that the amount of research that's done on these larger issues has not produced settled answers. There's all kinds of different sorts of answers. The starting point that I want you to get today is that the question wasn't even really asked by Trebilcock and Kelly. And a great deal of up until very recently anyway, a great deal, not just in Canada, but around the world, a great deal of the research on migration has been done from a national point of view that has been operating to a great degree independently of, as though the only interesting and the only important questions are, what can we do here in Canada to adapt to, and for many researchers, this includes make it better for, but even those researchers tend to focus their attention only on what's going on in Canada. And that's a mistake, because some of the things that are going on in Canada are going on in Canada as a result of these larger global processes. Canada wanted to make the reason Canada wanted to make a railroad, to choose your excellent example, was that the Canadian economy was starting to transform itself into a commodity producing economy. We had because we conquered North America and stole the land from the people who lived here, what we were going to do with this stolen property was turn it into farms. And in order to make those farms lucrative, we had to be able to take that wheat and not just make it into bread for local people. We had to make it into a commodity that could be put on trains, shipped across North America, put onto boats around the world, so that the class that benefits financially from an expanding economy would be able to maximize their return on their profit. It wasn't just so that tourists could go across the country or anything along those lines. Now, I want to be sure to separate two different points. One is more controversial, one is not very controversial. The not controversial point is that this is what was going on. The Canadian economy was developing, and everyone agrees that migration is important in Canada for economic reasons. That the size of the country, and in order for the Canadian economy to operate at all, even before our birth rate began to decline. So at the beginning of Canada as a roughly more or less sort of independent country, we needed more laborers than we could produce for economic reasons. Everyone agrees with that. And everybody who studies immigration, everybody who's thought about immigration for even 10 seconds understands that that's what was driving the immigration of workers to Canada. What's missing from that is, why was that going on? Now, the controversial part resides in my analysis of that international global economy. The analysis that I'm suggesting is the best explanatory model to see why the particular way that migration occurred is basically a socialist explanation. And so it goes against, I disagree with the analysis that's provided by most political scientists, and most economists for sure disagree with that analysis. Now, I want to also, as a matter of fact, it is the case that there are many, many scholars who do agree with the point of view I'm describing. It's just not the majority opinion. So there's a non-controversial assumption that I want to call to your attention. And I raise that non-controversial assumption largely in order to try to articulate the much more controversial framework that I'm discussing. Did that answer some of your point, Tahura?
Yeah, it's more clear now. Thank you.
Okay, so you're welcome. Thank you for taking the time and to use your voice. That's very helpful to me, and I think to everybody. But so to understand the restructuring of global spanning, so one of the features about migration studies today is that it has an added urgency. There's a lot more interest in 2021 around migration studies than there was, say, in the 1980s, and even in the 1990s. Migration, although the numbers themselves have not really increased as much as some have argued, if you take a look at the long-term data, it's in the news more, and it's the object of political discussion to a greater extent. And some of that has to do with changes in the global economy. Globalization is a central topic of conversation today, and an important component of globalization is the extent to which people are more mobile and people are moving around more in the 21st century than they had in the past. Now, so this global. So this slide you have in front of us is more about, say, since the year 2000 than it is before the year 2000. In the next few weeks, I'm going to develop an argument that tries to challenge that timing. On my view, this is a longer term development than what the most widely advocated account of globalization. Many people argue as though globalization started with the internet or something along those lines, and I'm going to try to offer an argument that challenges that a little bit. But for now, what I want to point out is I just want to read this out and break it down a little bit. The restructuring of global spanning institutional arrangements, including, so in order to understand the restructure of global spanning institutional arrangements, including the changing role and continuing significance of states, we need a perspective that is not constrained by the borders of the nation state. And then, so we need a perspective that is not constrained by the borders of the nation state. And that's what methodological nationalism is, a perspective that is constrained by those borders. Now, the peculiar part is that studying immigration is studying what's going on at those borders, and the borders only exist because there's two sides of them. So it is a peculiar feature that requires a little bit of explaining, it seems to me anyway, how it is that you could have a study of immigration that doesn't take a look at what's going on the other side of the border. Now, then the other point is, Now, in the case of Canada, Canada becomes a country in the first place because of these global changes. Now, I'm not going to have the time to go into this in any length at all, but in 1867, the Great Britain is the global superpower. It's the wealthiest country in the world, and its wealth depends on its ability to govern this global empire that they have, and that global empire is under tremendous pressure. And it's in response to this global pressure that Great Britain begins to modify its relationship to its colonies. And as it backs away from its colonial relationship to Canada, it expands its colonial relationships to the rest of what becomes the developing world. And so in 1867, Great Britain grants to Canada its independence, but at the same time, it's expanding its control over India. It's expanding its control over many areas in Africa and in Asia. And it's doing that in order to secure its financial interests. And in doing that, Great Britain transforms its own understanding of itself. What it means to be a citizen, not a citizen, a subject of the crown in Britain is transformed during the Victorian era as a result of this global imperialist project. And over the course of Canadian history, our relationship to Great Britain, in the earliest part of Canada's history, it's our relationship to Great Britain that is the most important economic and political relationship. Over time, that shifts, and eventually, Great Britain is displaced in the importance of Great Britain is replaced by the United States as the 20th century develops. And that's true of Canada, and it's also true of the entire world. In 1867, without any doubt, there's no disagreement here, as far as I know anyway, Great Britain is the most economically and militarily powerful nation in the world. By 1967, it's the United States that's the most powerful economic, earlier than that, but certain, just to pick round numbers, 100 years later, without a doubt, the United States is the most powerful economic and the most powerful military and the most powerful political country in the world. And in 1867, the Canadian economy is extraordinarily tied to the English economy. And by the end of World War II, the Canadian economy is increasingly tied to the US and increasingly disconnecting from the English economy. In part, the perspective that I'm proposing to bring to bear on our ongoing understanding of the relationship between belonging and citizenship and globalization has to do with what is the correct understanding between economics and politics. And understood in those senses, it's understood in that sense, want us to try to rethink how we understand the relationship between ideas and interests. So what are some of the ways that Trebilcock and Kelly's account is constrained by the borders of the nation state? Well, that's what I was trying to explain a little bit. Trebilcock and Kelly operate very, very largely on an internal kind of account of what's going on. I haven't asked you to read their entire book, but when they come to the 1960s and 1970s, which is essentially the fundamental turning point in Canadian immigration policy and practice, Canada, over the course of the 60s and 70s, abandons its explicitly white supremacist immigration policy and opens up its, relatively speaking, opens up its borders to steady migration from countries that are predominantly peopled by Black and brown people. So we shift from a migration inflow of predominantly white people to a migration inflow of predominantly not white people over the 60s and 70s. And when Trebilcock and Kelly try to understand that, their account of it is focused on whose interests and which ideas are predominant in the transformation of that policy. And what's missing from that, the way that that analysis is constrained by the borders, is that they fail to include in their analysis how do the business interests in Canada, or how are the business interests in Canada affected by events that are going on outside of Canada's borders? How is the transformation of the global economy, what are the consequences from the transformation of the global economy on the understanding of business interests in Canada, such that it resulted in this change in immigration policy? As they point out, as many, many people have pointed out who've studied this, it's business interests that have pushed for steady immigration policy. Business interests want more workers in Canada. And why do they want more workers in Canada? Why do businesses need workers? We went over this last time and you got it right, so I know you know. Right. Businesses need labor. And what do they do with the labor? What they do is they put the labor to work in order to extract profit from the result of that labor. Yes. Now the exploit is so now that's a secondary consideration. So now Latoya raises an important issue, Latoya raises an issue whose importance is in some ways at the heart of the disagreement between the controversial view that I think is the right view, and the more widely accepted view that I think is mistaken. And so, one of the ways that labor is described as increasing the population of Canada is described as an important policy goal is because a larger population is going to spend money and is going to require services, and that'll create jobs, something along those lines. Is that what you had in mind, Latoya? Right. And I'm not saying that's not true. I'm just saying that that is, at best, a secondary consideration. Uh, and that in order for businesses to be successful, by definition, what it is that their labor produces has to have a greater value than the cost of that labor. You cannot have a successful capitalist business if the labor costs equal the return on the value of what it is they're producing. Capitalism depends on labor being underpaid for the value of its work. So I want to see exactly what you said. Yes, optics is a tricky issue. For sure, optics matters. And the thing about optics is, well, okay, Don, I'll just put it back to you. Why describe it as optics as opposed to a real interest? How did you understand it as optics? That makes it, to me, that suggests that it's an illusion, that it's not the real reason. Right. So I'm not disagreeing with you. Um, Optics, business wants to look good only up to a certain point, right? As long as it doesn't cost more money than they bring back, then absolutely business interests are sensitive to their brand, and businesses understand that their ability to continue to be profitable depends in part on the public perception of their brand. But what makes it a business interest rather than something else is that it's calculated in terms of its contribution to the profitability of the investment that's put in. Is that what you were thinking about, Don? Right. And so in a certain way, it's easy. When the optics end up making more money, then there's no problem. The challenge comes when the optics seem to get in the way. And so we get something like Facebook having a problem, or Facebook and Twitter. So recently, Twitter had to kick Donald Trump, or I don't know about had to. Recently, Twitter kicked Donald Trump off his account, or I don't know how to describe it exactly. I'm not on Twitter, but Donald Trump had a Twitter account and they suspended it. And this is an instance where it would be tricky. Why? What are the if you were in charge of, imagine you're in a meeting at the headquarters of Twitter, and there's a bunch of people, and they some people say, look, we got to get rid of Trump, and other people say, what, are you crazy? We're not going to get rid of Trump. What are the different things that they would consider when they were working through that decision?
Hi, it's Dawn.
Hi, Don.
I think some of the things they would consider is how they look, the optics of it, of course. I mean, if he's spouting things that go against their policies and their how their image is, then it doesn't look good on them to allow him to do that. But he's just the loudest voice of all these people. There's tons of people who are using Twitter to spout that kind of information, like QAnon and all that kind of stuff. So them banning Trump, it makes them look better, I guess, depending on, but then you also lose freedom of speech, right? So.
Right, but let's put freedom of speech. Okay, well, let's just do it. Twitter has nothing to do with freedom of speech. Freedom of speech in the constitutional context of the United States and incidentally of Canada, that only means the government can't prevent you from freely expressing your views. It doesn't mean, let's say you felt strongly about some particular issue and you wrote a letter to the Globe and Mail and you wanted them to publish it. The Globe and Mail, your freedom of speech doesn't extend to the Globe and Mail having to publish your letter. What it does extend to is the government can't arrest you if the Globe and Mail decides to publish your letter. And you say, I think, for example, that the Canadian government is doing a terrible thing by not canceling the military contract we have with Saudi Arabia to supply them with military vehicles. My freedom of speech allows me to, write a letter to the Globe and Mail, and if the Globe and Mail publishes it, the government can't arrest me for that. But the Globe and Mail, they don't have to publish my letter. So Twitter doesn't have to allow you to say what you want, and they can just not. They can censor you, is really what I mean, without breaking the law. The point I was trying to raise is if it was just that, then Twitter would have got rid of Trump a long time ago. The reason that they like Trump, I'm sure, is because Trump has how many million followers on Twitter? Trump's controversial views, good or bad or indifferent, generate lots of revenue for Twitter. And so from that point of view, Twitter, it would have been a difficult decision for Twitter to cancel Trump. But it's not separate totally the fact that other people will have quit Twitter because Trump used Twitter. So that's a hard one to say, but Trump used Twitter so much that some people who disagreed with Trump or who, didn't like Trump might boycott Twitter. And so they're going to weigh it, but they're not going to weigh it in terms of good and bad. They're going to weigh it in terms of what?
Profits, definitely. But
exactly.
That's what I was
Profits
trying to
and
say,
loss.
yeah. Like,
Right.
who are you attracting and making angry when you ban somebody like Trump? Like, that's what I mean by the freedom of speech. Americans who support Trump are going to be angry and then maybe choose not to use Twitter for that reason. That's kind of what, yeah, you said it in a much better way, but that's what I meant.
Okay, good. So, and to some degree, in the same way, business interests have been largely interested in, and we know this, and one of the strengths of the book is that they cite chapter and verse, and so they cite reports by the Canadian business, the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, and a number of different officially organized business interests participated actively in the parliamentary process of developing policy, and regularly they insisted, privately and publicly, overall in favor of expanding immigration, and they did it for very largely anyway, the reasons that they do anything in business, and that's to make more money. That's what business interests are. They want to make more money. That doesn't seem especially controversial. The controversial part comes into, is that always, or is that even ever, what's right and what's best for everybody else in the country? And that's sort of the socialist part of the analysis that I'm going to try to spell out. But I'm conscious in at least two separate ways of the challenge that presents. The course that we're doing is a course in social science, and I want to do my best to demonstrate to you that the arguments that I'm going to challenge and the arguments I'm going to present all operate within the broad university academic framework of accepted social scientific practice. So I regularly am going to be citing research from university publications and international organizations, so that it's not just some kook. I'm not just. This is not. I don't want this to come off like that it's QAnon or something like this. These are university professors doing, or people who work for well-known, long-lasting international organizations. Now, at the same time, I don't want to pretend like it's everybody's view. It's absolutely not everybody's view. There's a very, very large, I would say a preponderant even component of the social scientific community that rejects the analysis that I'm going to develop for you. But it's not just kookiness on my part. And also, sort of separately, I don't want to end up this being just me preaching to you. I want to engage you in this discussion, and I want to engage you in the terms that it's being engaged in the social scientific literature. And one way of framing that for you is helpfully, I don't think intentionally, but helpfully picked up in, started by Trebilcock and Kelly's contrast between ideas and interests. And on the political economy framework, political economy as an academic discipline is in some ways code for a kind of socialist approach, a social science socialist approach. And there the argument is that ideas and interests can't exist independently of each other. And that one of the ways that capitalism operates as a social reality is by reinforcing what ultimately is an illusion that the economy is a standalone, self-sufficient aspect of human life. And that's why it's called political economy. The idea in part is that no economic system ever operates except in terms of a political framework. All economies need some kind of political framework. And when you examine the political framework of capitalist economies, what you notice is that the interests of capital always end up outweighing the interests of labor. That's the basic framework. And Canadian immigration history is, in a way, a good test case for that, because Canadian immigration from 1867 on, from earlier too, but clearly from 1867 on, has been driven by competing arguments around who and how many and when and why should more laborers be admitted into Canada, who was for it and who was against it, and which government parties and which government policies were pursued in support of these policies is the what it is that the political economist and the view that Schlick-Giller observes, the changing global structure of the global restructuring of capital, is the background condition against which we have to understand why it is that European migrants were allowed at one period and why it is all of a sudden that Canada changed its mind about who was going to come. We began to admit immigrants from the Caribbean, from India, from Asia, and now slowly, increasingly from Africa as well. What was going on in Canada can only be understood if we take a look at the global economic context as well. And so now let me just see what my next slide was. So the second component, and I'll wrap it up with this, the second component that is largely missing from Trebilcock and Kelly's account, and also here, Trebilcock and Kelly's book is a good example of what that older literature looked like. It rarely takes account of the migrants' interests and perspectives, and also their role in these changes. And so methodological nationalism isn't just a narrowed perspective on how to understand the competing factors that go into the policies and the changes in the policies, but it also fails to appreciate the agency, the impact that the migrants themselves have always had, both in terms of what's going on in the countries that they came from and the countries that they come to. And so one of the ways of understanding the one issue where this does emerge almost immediately is around the issue of brain drain and brain gain. And that issue is what we'll be looking at. We'll be looking at that issue in a couple of lectures. Okay, so right, and so it's against the back. So the general global changes is the contemporary restructuring of capital, and that is what basically the political economy, social science perspective, that's how they describe, that's how we describe globalization. Globalization represents a restructuring of capital that is captured by the changes in post-World War II international trade agreements that allow for a much freer movement of capital around the world. And what I'm interested in stressing is the consequences that this restructuring of capital's movement around the world, the impact that has had on the movement of people around the world. You can't understand global migration without understanding it as a movement of labor, and labor moves largely because of what capital does. And so it's that relationship between labor and capital that I will be focusing on, but I want to move back and forth between the Canadian context and the global context in order to see the interactions, the chief interactions between those moving parts. Okay, so that's it for my presentation. I've posted this morning the second discussion board and the link to the movie Who Gets In that is about some of these issues. And so I hope you will all take a look at that very soon. Keisha, did you have a question? Okay, so I'm going to turn off the recording now.